Welcome to Think Ahead, London Business School's Thought Leadership event series. I'm Julian Birkinshaw. I'm the Vice Dean and I'm a Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the school. And this evening's event, we're calling it How AI Innovation, Artificial Intelligence Innovation in Healthcare Will Improve Our Lives. I'm going to introduce our panelists shortly, but before I do so, I just want to acknowledge that we've got an opportunity for you to ask questions to the panel. You should see the space bar where you can add your questions, which we will take a look at and we'll ask towards the end. And also, before we get going, I want to share the results of a poll that we did on LinkedIn, which some 350 people filled in. This was just to just get a little bit of a sense of what you are thinking. We asked you two questions, and you should be able to see the results right now. First question was, in your opinion, what is the most significant impact of AI in healthcare? And your answer was 47% of you said that refining diagnostic capabilities was the most important. Second, more access to healthcare services. Some of you said equally significant. Let me just acknowledge that there's going to be a few other ways in which AI is impacting healthcare, which our panelists are going to talk about. So they'll talk about those ones, but they're going to talk about a few others as well. And then secondly, we asked, do you believe AI can help address healthcare disparities by providing better healthcare access to remote or underserved areas? And unambiguously, you said yes. 80% of you said yes, it can. And again, that's going to be an issue that we're going to get our panelists to talk a little bit about, probably towards the end of the session. So it is a great pleasure to introduce four distinguished speakers, joining you from different parts of the world, from Boston to London to India. First of all, we have Barbara Domayne-Hayman, entrepreneur in residence at the Francis Crick Institute and an LBS alumna from the Sloan Fellowship. She has a background in biotech and big pharma, AstraZeneca, among others. Now runs an accelerator at the Francis Crick called KQ Labs. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Thanks. Second, we have Crystal Ruff, Senior Director of Neuroscience and Vaccines at Takeda, and also an LBS alumna. She has a PhD in neuroscience. She leads scientific and medical team in the US. Also has a lot of experience investing in startups. Hi, Crystal. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you.
Julian.
Thanks.
Pleasure to be here.
Third, we have Nicos Savva, Professor of Management Science Operations at London Business School, so a colleague of mine, a real expert on artificial intelligence, the underlying, if you like, science of artificial intelligence, and also about how it's being applied in healthcare, among other sectors. Hi, Nicos.
Hi, everyone.
And last but not least, Andrew Vallance-Owen, Chief Medical Officer of Medicover and Chair of Serena and Fitness Genes, who also spent many, many years as Chief Medical Officer at Bupa Healthcare, now works a lot in the startup space. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Thanks. Joining us, I believe, from India, rather late into the evening right now. So thanks for joining us. So I want to give each of you a chance just to share some initial thoughts. First, a little bit more about what you do, but also perhaps focusing on where you see the most exciting AI innovations in the healthcare area from your perspective. We want to just get a few examples just to get us going. Barbara, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thanks very much, and delighted to be here. So by background, I'm actually a PhD chemist. I then went into the corporate world, into marketing, spent 11 years there, had an early midlife crisis and went to London Business School, where, thanks to the Sloan programme, I stumbled upon the world of entrepreneurship, and that completely changed my career path. So I really owe LBS a huge debt of gratitude. So for the last 20 odd years, I've been working in the biotech sector. And about 6 years ago, I became, amongst other things, entrepreneur in residence at the Francis Crick Institute. And there we observed this very exciting area where basically data and biomedical science were converging. And in this converging area, which is an interface, interfaces are always challenging. We noticed that the very early stage companies were really struggling to get investment because biotech investors understand those particular business models, but the business models in this new emerging area are completely different. And tech investors we're okay about the business models, but they don't understand the world of healthcare and all the regulatory implications. So these very early stage companies really struggling. So we thought, well, if we don't do something to support the early stage, we will not have an ecosystem that we deserve to have in the UK. So what we thought as one institution, what could we do? We started an accelerator program. And it's for data-driven health startups from all across the UK. And each year we select 10 companies that are very exciting. Now, I'll just give you a snapshot of what kinds of companies we have. So they generally fall into 3 categories, and AI is definitely a theme in all of these. We have companies that use AI in drug discovery, so that basically faster, better, cheaper ways of discovering new drugs. Examples of that, PharmEnable is doing small molecule drug discovery. We also have Base Immune, which is using AI to design antigens for vaccines, which is obviously very topical in the context of COVID, etc. The second category we have is around diagnostics and actually precision medicine. So that basically enables potentially earlier detection of disease. So for instance, Oxford Cancer Analytics detects lung cancer earlier than other forms. And Queen's Square Analytics uses MRI imaging to detect what treatment regimen would be the best for a particular multiple sclerosis patient. Other companies look at cancer and what is the right treatment regimen for that particular patient, and that's using AI. And then there's a third category, which is a bit more patient-facing directly, and that can be, for instance, remote monitoring of patients. It can be using an iPhone to do that remote monitoring. And for instance, ophthalmology, you can monitor patients and monitor the progression of their eye disease at home, so they don't have to keep coming into the hospital unless it's absolutely necessary. We have companies that help patients with Parkinson's disease, also patients that help, for instance, stroke rehabilitation. So really a profusion of areas where AI is making a huge impact into healthcare. And each year we get a large number of applications, and we kind of get a feel for the zeitgeist and what areas are up and coming. We can judge that each year. There's a little bit of a wave. So I can talk about that later.
We'll come back to that. Thank you so much. Crystal, let's go to you now. Tell us a little bit about what's exciting in terms of AI innovation in your world.
Right. So hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Crystal Ruff, and I am the Senior Scientific Director at Takeda Pharmaceuticals for U.S. Medical, Neuroscience, and Vaccines. So my team primarily works with healthcare providers to determine how they're interacting with patients to help improve the patient experience. Prior to that, I was in strategy consulting, where we worked a lot in digital enablement for large companies. Prior to that, I worked with Illumina. So I was lead of strategic initiatives and innovation for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And whilst at Illumina, side by side with Barbara, I created the first genomic-specific accelerator in Europe, Illumina Accelerator UK, and we can talk a little bit about some of the learnings in genomics. And prior to that, I did the traditional route of PhD postdoc, which led me to the London Business School, appreciating the commercial realm. So in terms of AI and healthcare, I don't want to overlap with what Barbara said, and I think you really covered a lot of it, Barbara. So the 2 things I might add, where I can add some differentiated experience. So looking also, you talked a little bit about patient journey, and apps for the patient, and how do we care on the end of the patient pathway. I think that's very important, and looking at right now with the increasing cost of all healthcare systems, there's an aging population, and I think it's something like 80% of our healthcare dollars are spent after the age of 65, and 65% of that is spent in the last year of life. Right. And globally, we have, Julian, you can speak to this better than I can, but we have a globally aging population. So we need to find ways that we can save cost and still deliver the same or better standard of care. And that necessitates using AI and data. The second thing, I'll stick to my genomics roots, and I mean like meta-affairs, we're using it in meta-affairs, but I think Andrew will speak to that. In genomics specifically, we have only recently had the technology to sequence, and I'm saying genomics, but now it's extended to proteomics, epigenomics, all sorts of things that are happening in complex ways in our body. We only now have, I think it's been about 5 years since we've had the technology where we can sequence it, and the chips that we can't, that are sophisticated enough to do it. You know, I remember during my MBA in 2014 to 2016, we were the year of big data. Yeah. And the world was just learning about what big data was. Yeah. And this AI in healthcare, it's the next step, it's the next evolution. Yeah. Along that pathway.
Good. And we're going to come back to exactly what sort of change to make all that possible shortly. Actually, I'm going to go to Andrew next and then Nicos last, if that's okay. Andrew, tell us a little bit about your work and where you see the biggest opportunities in AI.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. Well, I started my career as a surgeon, but as you said, I became Chief Medical Officer of Bupa, where I was for 17 years. I'm going to just mention one project there, which is relevant. I initiated the first program using the routine use of patient-reported outcomes back in the late 90s. From there came the NHS National Programme, a pilot programme collecting routinely patient-reported outcomes. And from there, a huge database has been formed for hip and knee replacement, outcomes in hip and knee replacement, which of course, these massive real-world databases and big data need AI to keep them organized. I retired, so-called, in 2012, and as you said, became Chief Medical Officer of Medicover, which is operating in Eastern Europe, Germany and India, where we have 26 hospitals and where I am now, as you said. But what we also have is a very big diagnostics division in Germany, increasingly working on developing genetic testing and genetic counseling. And again, as has already been said, you know, AI is crucial with that huge volume of data. You mentioned that I'm involved in some startups, which is true. I've just got 3 examples. The first one I got involved with is called I Am YM, which is a very good health and well-being startup. They have their own LLM. They've got
large language model, just in case.
Yeah, sorry, yes, yeah. It's sort of chat box stuff, I suppose. But 250,000 research papers in the health and well-being space from high-impact journals, as well as data coming in from customers. A huge amount of AI to bring that all together, run by the redoubtable Lorena Puica, some of you may have heard of. Serena is a mental health app. I chair their board, and in mental, as I say, in mental health, doing solely digital CBT. So it's disruptive because it doesn't involve any clinical input at all, which is pretty disruptive actually. And we're beginning to use AI for detecting mental health issues. And the third one is called Fitness Genes. I just wanted a bit of variety. And it does a simple genetic test, tells somebody their genetic makeup entirely only related to genes relating to fitness, and gives advice on how they can manage their health in view in that context. You know, generally, I believe really strongly in the developing value of artificial intelligence, both in healthcare, but particularly in health promotion. You know, healthcare systems these days can't afford to get into prevention, it seems, and it seems that the private sector and these startups are really taking hold, and it's going to be hugely valuable for the country, I think, and generally for healthcare, that sort of work. I do get concerned about the talk about sort of AI taking over altogether the work of doctors. I don't believe that's right, and I think it's a long way off. But instead, I think much greater priority should be given to providing support and to complement doctors and healthcare workers to give them more time with patients. And I think there's huge opportunities there, both clinically and administratively.
Thanks. Good. So let's hear finally from Nicos, and if you can give us a few thoughts on both where the opportunities are, most exciting things are, but also if you can start to unpack a little bit about what we mean by AI, because of course, nowadays people leap to generative AI because we've all started playing with ChatGPT, but there's lots of different varieties of AI out there, and I'd like you to just help open the black box a little bit around that.
So great to be here. Thank you for organizing, Julian. So yeah, I mean, AI has been around a long time before ChatGPT, which only came about 11 months ago. So, and in general, AI is the sort of, tools, processes, algorithms, if you like, that have the ability to learn and detect patterns directly from data. So unlike sort of, traditional computing systems where sort of a human expert needed to program everything that was relevant for the system before the system was implemented, with AI, the algorithm is given a large set of data and is asked to figure out what patterns exist in the data directly. And obviously, this has had a huge amount of application in anything that involves prediction or classification. So, for example, the problem of whether a radiography sort of image is consistent with healthy tissue or sort of unhealthy cancer tissue. It's a classic classification problem, and artificial intelligence has been really good at doing that. What happened, though, with generative AI is that suddenly artificial intelligence managed to crack natural language. So it was able to understand and produce natural language at the level we humans understand it. And that kind of opens a huge amount of applications that involve sort of, understanding, processing, and applying human knowledge. And this got a lot of people, including me, really excited about the potential for sort of, in general, but specifically for healthcare. So, and if I can give you like a couple of examples, there's the first studies on generative AI that are coming out in sort of rigorous sort of, scientific journals that sort of, and generally the studies sort of, take a group of knowledge-based workers, be it in healthcare or outside healthcare, and sort of they're given some tasks to complete. One group gets access to ChatGPT or an equivalent language model, and the other group doesn't. And then the research compares how the performance of the two groups that were very similar to start with changes after one group is exposed to and has access to this technology. And the findings are astonishing. So we're finding that knowledge-based workers, these are us, they are able to do sort of the stuff they were doing before, but sort of taking a third less time. So that's 33% productivity gains. At the same time, quality, depending on the context, might improve a little bit. It certainly doesn't deteriorate. And also, interestingly enough, the benefits accrue mostly to the people that are least experienced. So they perform almost as well as they are more experienced sort of colleagues that don't have access to ChatGPT. So ChatGPT also improves the sort of the performance of people that are experienced, but by not as much. So people call ChatGPT the great sort of equalizer. So if you think about the implications for this on healthcare, I mean, in general, knowledge-based work has not had a productivity boost sort of of any significant magnitude ever, and healthcare probably never. So we are sitting in a situation where sort of a lot of the tasks that we do in healthcare can be done again by sort of the expert human, because the human expertise is needed, but they can be done faster. And the more repetitive, more sort of boring stuff, if you like, can be even done by ChatGPT or equivalent models, sort of very quickly. So I'm very excited about this potential to take away work that's not value adding and sort of automate it. And I think this is where we're going to see a huge amount of innovation going forward.
So I want to come back to the kind of taking out of certain types of repetitive work in about 5 minutes. But just before we do that, you made the right point, I think, which is that a lot of AI was being used for prediction and for classification. It's also been quite useful. I mean, I think, Barbara, you mentioned it. I mean, it's actually used in drug discovery as well. Tell us, what, I don't mind who answers this question, but why has it suddenly taken off? In other words, what has happened in the last, let's say, 5 years, which has allowed us suddenly to see this booming creativity and innovation in AI? I mean, we've had AI for as long as we've had computers, but suddenly it's proliferating. Anyone want to help me with what's exactly changed in the last 5 years?
I could have a go saying.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So I think, three things came about at roughly the same time. The first, a few people have mentioned it. We now have bigger data sets, more detailed data sets that we had before. But that's probably the least important. The most important are the other two. So we have a lot more computational power than we had before with the advent of computers that are very well suited to parallelizing tasks. So they can do a lot of tasks simultaneously, and that enables us to do a lot more calculations per unit of time, if you like. But perhaps the most important one is new algorithms that, like the transformer architecture, which is the T in the GPT, which has allowed us to parallel process sort of very complicated tasks such as language recognition, but not only. And that makes them well suited to run on this new hardware that can parallelize processes. So these strings together, so more processing power, more data, and better algorithmic architectures have allowed models to scale. And by scaling, they've become surprisingly good. Like nobody, I mean, I've been following the GPT sort of evolution from GPT-2 to GPT-3. I mean, I wasn't expecting, more people were not expecting such a degree of improvement, but it turns out that there's something magic going on with scaling these models, and larger models are not just a little bit better than smaller models, which is sort of, typically what you observe, but larger models genuinely have new capabilities that smaller models didn't have. Sounds like magic.
Thank you. Crystal, you had a point?
I would add one more thing to what Nico said as well, of things that are happening in parallel, is our ability to store data as well. And that's doubling, almost year on year, it's doubling exponentially. And so finally, we have servers that are small enough to fit in a warehouse or a room or whatever you need, but are also powerful enough to store all of the data that we've been collecting.
I've got a question. I mean, maybe I'll take it to Barbara first, but I mean, I get it that, if you're diagnosing cancer or whatever, you've got very clever algorithms which can crunch through millions of previous examples of cancerous and non-cancerous cells or whatever. But Barbara, you mentioned drug discovery, right? I think of drug discovery as a creative activity. And, the way I think about large language models is, by definition, they are trained on pre-existing stuff, right? So how does AI make the creative leaps that we typically, attribute to humans?
Well, that's a huge question. I mean, it actually helps to identify what are the best targets for the drugs to actually latch onto. And then in other ways, it also looks at the massive amount of chemical space that there is, and basically iterates in a way that is unimaginably fast compared to what humans could do. But I think there's one other point I'd like to make, which is very important, which is there is a bit of a fly in the ointment with this, which is that it all depends on the quality of the data. So basically basically garbage in, garbage out. And essentially the quality of the data is absolutely critical. And with human health, you've got added dimensions where you're taking samples from people. And so a lot depends on how the sample was taken, how the sample was stored, how it was analyzed, and the quality of that. And then on top of the quality of that, you've then got the potential biases that are introduced by not having a sort of a representative sample of many, many different types. So, for instance, of different ethnicities. Indeed. So, and also gender, because historically clinical trials have been done, mainly on men of a certain age range of sort of 18 to 60. So, so I think, the quality of the data is absolutely critical, and we have to look at this quite critically.
Thank you. I want to come back to the issues around bias and ethics and stuff on. But Andrew, one question to you before I think we kind of move to a whole different category of questions. You talked about patient-facing applications. Some of your work is very specifically kind of working with individuals. How does AI do that? Because obviously, we've talked a lot about classification. We've talked a lot about, if you like, creativity. This is about interacting with humans, right? I mean, can you just give us a bit more of a flavor about how AI does that? Because again, I think of, relating to other people to kind of encourage them perhaps to behave in a different way as a fairly human thing, which computers aren't particularly good at.
No, and I think the direct human intervention is like the human intervention with a chatbot, really. So if I come back to I am, why am, you know, you are dealing, what they use is an interface, an avatar, if you like, you know, who they can speak to. So they try and mimic, as we do in Serena, actually, in the mental health field, mimic a human, and we try and make it as human-like as we possibly can. And that can work if you do it properly. I want to just come back on one point you made there about radiology, which of course everyone knows is being sort of one use for AI, but you may have seen the other day that NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, has just said that they don't agree that there is enough evidence for using AI for diagnosis of lung cancer at the moment. It could be lung cancer could be missed, or people having unnecessary surgery. So there is a worry about the underlying the data, the training that's done on the data in the first place, which, and to echo Barbara's point, this whole point about ethnicity and you know, that sort of thing as well.
So let's go there now, because I do want to come back to this issue about, you know, sort of making the healthcare system as a whole work more efficiently. But let's talk about ethics, privacy, data, all those types of things. You both correctly, I think, pointed out that, you know, by definition, the large language model is only as good as the data it's trained on. What are some of the other risks and threats that make the use of AI in the healthcare sector a little bit challenging? Maybe Chris, would you want to give us a couple of thoughts on that, and then we'll go around the room?
Sure. So the biggest risk of AI in the healthcare sector, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I've been talking about, albeit, you know, be it in pharma, be it in other areas, is data security. And how do we combine our data? You know, and I think we saw a great example of in COVID. One of the silver linings of something very terrible is a lot of pharma companies were able to collaborate, work together to get to a vaccine as fast as possible. And, you know, one of the things that we're looking at is how do we share data? How do we access data, even internally within pharma companies? It's so siloed. And so solutions have emerged that use what's called federated data systems and sharing of data, whereby the data can stay in its silo, it can stay in its server storage room. And I don't know, one's in China, one's in Zurich, and one is in Brazil. And it can still be stored with that country level specific governance, but you can send queries on a network on top of that. You know, so for example, if I want to know how many 5-year-old kids are in the school district of London, instead of getting all of the attendance sheets and getting through all the information, I can send a query on top. And one school will say 3 kids, 5 kids, 7, 8, 10, and I can get my answer that way. And that's how a federated system works. So I think, in answer to your question, number one is how do we provide secure data that is useful?
And you're saying that technically that's possible. I get that.
Yes.
Are we seeing countries allowing that?
Yeah. So even I mean, this is not 5 years ago. I went to, I think, Estonia, Denmark, and some other country in the Nordics have a federated system. And they're able to access, and you can control the user permissions to see who can access what. But you know, the DMV data stays at the DMV, the hospital data stays at the hospital, but you can then you can cross-reference it and say, you know, how many people who have been in car accidents got their license from the DMV within a month of their car accident, or something like that. And those are the more sophisticated queries that can really inform what we're doing.
Of course, overcoming the data privacy problems. Andrew, yeah, please.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with all that. But I think trust is going to be an issue. I mean, driverless cars, we all thought were going to be great, but, you know, one accident and the whole world says they're rubbish. And we've got to be careful with things like ChatGPT. I mean, they say themselves, they have a quote, "This does not mean have the ability to verify accuracy or credibility of every source." They say that themselves. So that's a worry. And we know that there are these sort of hallucination things where if they can't find a true answer, they may go off and find an answer which isn't true. And that's going to lead to a lack of trust. So that's really got to be sorted out, I think. And then it's also open to misinformation, scams, manipulation. You know, we know that scammers can get through almost every system, whatever you do. And so the security issue, I suppose, is vital there, and you know, personal data, the point that Crystal was making, will be a worry if people are submitting their data onto these things, and the inter-country thing is really quite complicated.
I mean, it's a daunting problem in all walks of life, how the AI is abused, and it's even more so in healthcare. I can completely see that. We'll go to Barbara next, and then we'll go to Nicos.
Yeah, I mean, just to combine actually some themes that both Crystal and Andrew have raised. I mean, I think trust is massively important, and also that people feel that they have control over how their data is being used. So, for instance, there are companies that are helping to enroll into clinical trials. Cynogenetics is one, but they allow the people to control their own data, and they go back to the patients and they say, would you like your data to be used in this particular way, in this particular trial? And the patients can say yes or no, actually, I don't want to be involved in that trial. And that's very empowering, and it really builds trust. And I think we had the issue in the UK a couple of years ago where basically data was going to be used in a certain way, and people didn't understand it, and they got really quite anxious, and the whole thing was withdrawn, which I think is a great shame. If it had been done in the right way, it's something that would be immensely powerful.
Yeah.
So Nicos, how are we going to crack these problems? What do you reckon?
So absolutely. I mean, I think some solutions sort of exist and they're technical, and you know, Crystal talked about federated learning. Differential privacy is another way of learning from data without sort of revealing too much about an individual. But I think sort of it would be naive to think that it can be solved only by better algorithms and better encryption, because nothing is completely safe. So therefore, you need to have sort of, you know, transparency. You need to get consent for people when that data is used in any way that they might not sort of, you know, explicitly have given permission for. And also trust works on the other end too. I mean, you need to have models that are able to explain what they predict and are able to sort of, you know, be audited. And if there are any issues, either with accuracy or with bias, this can be picked up. And this is not easy if it's a black box that makes the recommendations, but it becomes a little easier if the models are designed with explainability in mind, because sort of explainable models can be more easily sort of audited. Now, yeah, I want to also say something about sort of the point about sort of data being sort of very important, and obviously, you know, that it's hard to argue against it. But I think, you know, from that, we shouldn't conclude that we can't use AI unless the data is perfect, because sort of, you know, the data is never perfect. I think the right conclusion is that whenever we collect data, we need to be very careful in documenting the data collection, the data generation process. And if there are any imperfections, for these imperfections to be identified and to, at the very least, address it when we are training models. So yeah, very simple ways of addressing it. We will know that the boundaries of the model, that the model is not very good at making predictions outside its training set, or we might want to sort of deploy some ways to overcome data limitations. But obviously all of this is impossible if we start with the assumption that the data is perfect. So yeah.
Can I come back on just on that first point that Nicos was making? I mean, I think there are things that will have to be done. I mean, it's been suggested that all models should clearly describe their data sources. That's not done at the moment. It's completely unknown as to where their data comes from. Of course, in many places, it comes from all sorts of places, which makes it difficult to do that. But they should also the training should always try and make it more representative and less biased. And that's a long-term thing to do, because so much of research is, you know, North American and European, and you know, there is this bias. So I just thought, you know, there are things we can do. So we need to know the risks, and then we need to act to try and avoid them. But they are complicated, I think, to deal with.
Thank you. Crystal, last point on this, and then I'm going to move us to a different set of questions.
All right. So I just want to add on what Andrew was saying in terms of bias and in terms of these AI systems, and something that we really need to keep at top of mind, especially with diversity, equity, inclusion. Because if you have a system where only 18 to 60-year-old Caucasian men fed in, all outputs of that system are going to be skewed towards that demographic. So this makes an even stronger case. And there's a lot of population genomics initiatives going on, and I love it. It's fantastic. All of Us initiative in the States, and lots going on to make sure that the data going in is representative of the population of humans as we are. So like Barbara said, quality in, quality out, and let's keep that depth and breadth of quality going in.
Good. So change of pace now. And by the way, there's lots of good questions coming in. I'm actually picking up on some of those questions with what I'm asking the panelists. But we touched earlier, I think, Nicos, you mentioned it first, but the use of particularly generative AI in making us more productive. We've all experienced, I think most of you will have tried doing this, but using ChatGPT just simply to do certain rather boring tasks more effectively. It's very clear that there is a huge need to make healthcare systems more affordable, more effective. It is possible that AI is going to allow us to take out huge numbers of jobs from the systems. And I don't just mean healthcare. I mean, law firms and accountancy firms and goodness knows what else as well. I mean, in the same way that the Industrial Revolution changed manufacturing forever, artificial intelligence is affecting the world of professional work. So I guess my question is, where is the biggest opportunity to get these huge increases in essentially the efficiency of all the supporting infrastructure around healthcare? And how quickly is it happening? Because my nagging worry is that it's not actually going to be quite as efficient as we'd like it to be. Who'd like to have a first go at where the biggest opportunities are there?
I mean, I can tell a story. I can tell an
Go for it.
anecdote at work. So I think building on what Nicos said in terms of productivity, I heard this in the grapevine. I like to repeat it because it's really valuable, to the people who are saying, oh, AI is gonna steal our jobs. It's gonna take away our jobs. I like to say it's going to shift the role of the human, and no, Bob, it's not going to take your job, but someone using AI will. AI is not going to take it, but someone using it will, because there is that obligate human interactive element to make it work. And so actually, I think we have two listeners on the call today who I work with. So our field director and our scientific director, we had a problem. And so we had this report that needed to go out. There were hundreds of fields of information. Every few weeks it went out, and it was a very monotonous job. And it was the kind of job that you just put off doing, and it takes 3 weeks to do it, and by that time you got to start the next one. But it's useful. It was pulling in certain information and collating it into something usable. So we need it for the organization. And the three of us sat together and we did a pilot. And so, like I said, this was taking hours, like 6+ hours, human hours, difficult ones a week. And we just sat out and we fed it historical information. And we compared it to the human generated report that took weeks. And we compared we have an internal chat bot that it was anonymized, cleaned data. Let's point that out. Very important. So we cleaned it, we fed it in, and we looked at the thing that took 8 to 10 human hours and the thing that took 2 minutes on the equivalent of ChatGPT, and they were comparable.
Yeah. So here's, I mean,
There's no.
Julian, I mean, I get it, and I do completely see, because many of us have experienced this ourselves, the dramatic improvements in productivity that we get out of this stuff. My bigger question, and you touched on it, maybe Barbara, you can have a go at this, is yes, we're going to become better at doing specific tasks. We are, of course, as you say, going to become smarter at using AI to complement our human skills to do our jobs better.
Yeah.
But does that actually lead to the sort of organizational level efficiency improvements that we actually need? Because ultimately, if we're going to try to make the systems work better, we need to almost like redesign our entire processes, not just make each individual doing their own jobs more efficient. But Barbara, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give two examples, and I'm sure Andrew has a lot of very good examples here as well. So one is, I mean, we've talked about the use of AI to analyze images, radiology, and so on. There is a massive shortage of radiologists in this country, and indeed in most countries. And there's a terrible backlog of basically scans that need to be looked at, to be reviewed by these radiologists. If an AI can actually review the routine ones, the ones that basically fit into a normal pattern, that can save the radiologist's time to actually focus on the difficult cases. Right. So it's not that the radiologists are going to be done out of the job, quite the opposite. It means that they can actually concentrate on the patients that actually need a bit more effort and a bit more help. So that's one example. And the other example is just an anecdote. So I was on a panel discussion a few weeks ago with a clinician, and at the end I said, oh, so what would be the one key message you would say about the use of AI, you know, to the audience? And he said, do the simple stuff, do the boring stuff first, because all the use of AI that's patient facing is challenging. There are a lot of regulatory implications, especially with something that, you know, is evolving like an algorithm. So there's a lot of regulatory stuff that still is being worked through, but there's an enormous amount that can be done in the sort of the back office, the patient pathways, the organizational stuff, as you said, that is not necessarily quite so sensitive and is not regulatory in the same way. And that's absolutely perhaps the first opportunity. And I'm sure Andrew's got many examples of that.
Andrew, do you want to?
Well, I mean, the other area is pathology, particularly looking at blood smears for leukemias, where you have to look through a microscope at 100 different slides or 100 places on one slide to try and do a check whether you can find that bad cancerous cell. And of course, you look at the machines doing these in the laboratories, and they sort of flick through the pictures, just going bang, 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 and it's done in seconds. But there still has to be calibration. There still has to be someone checking because they can trend away from you know, so that there is always work to do to make sure that it's running properly. I mean, I think I'll come back to what I was saying about doctors earlier on. You know, I do feel that that's one area which is going to be much more difficult. I mean, to me, that first consultation with a doctor with a new condition is the foundation of medical practice. And if the doctor is a good doctor and actively listens, uses empathy, uses compassion, even humor, and gets the trust of the patient, then they'll get the proper story out of the patient. And that's where I find the difficulty in believing that chatbots would be able to do that, because it's a very personal experience. But it's after that the doctor can then use the sorts of things we've been hearing about and supportive and other technologies to complement that work and take them through after that. But I think that's a very important principle, actually, in medical practice.
Thank you. Nicos, you've got a point, and then I want to open up another question. Yeah?
You know, because you made a point, you asked the question, you know, are we going to see the organizational change required to see the benefits of this technology? And I think, so a point that I find very interesting about generative AI is that unlike, and you're absolutely right to ask this question, that, you know, any other innovation we had to come with explicit redesigns of processes and systems in order to see any productivity gains. So generative AI actually is backwards compatible with anything that we already have. So in a sense, I mean, if you're a hospital and you have an information system and sort of work processes, you don't need to fundamentally redesign them to start getting benefits out of using generative AI for doing some of the more repetitive tasks like coding, note keeping, sort of letter writing, and so forth. I mean, this can be done within the existing system. Now, obviously, in the long term, once you have these tools, you need to start thinking about how to design the system better.
I mean, I'm not an expert in healthcare, but I do know quite a lot about organization design and structure. And the trouble is, you make, sort of badly structured processes and workflows more efficient. That's helpful, but it's nowhere near as helpful as actually kind of re-engineering the process in the first place. And of course, the AI can't do that for us. I mean, unfortunately, if you think about the tortuous process of me getting the appointment at the hospital to get my hip checked. I got a new hip last year. I mean, there's no way AI can help us on that. We've got to get, and of course we've got years of bad examples of failed process redesign that need to be worked on and aren't yet sort of working. So I'm afraid I just leave that as a problem, unless one of you's got a bright idea about that. It does seem we need. Andrew,
well, I'm just thinking, I do agree. I think it is a change process, however much you may make it simple, Nicos. And we know that change is always very, very difficult, especially for the end user, even if it seems that it's going to make life much easier. It's amazing how much resistance you can get in big bureaucratic systems. And so you have to take account of that. And the educational processes and the building of the trust, which we came back to, is going to be fundamental right at the beginning, really, and all the way through that sort of change process.
Thanks. Barbara, did you want to add something to that? Or
yeah, I mean, I can't talk to the internal workings of a healthcare system where I intuitively feel there are massive opportunities. But for instance, remote monitoring of patients. So, I mean, Julian, you had to go in to have your hip checked after you'd had your operation. But if for instance, you had a chronic condition, then you would be able to be monitored at home potentially for many of the aspects of that condition. And you wouldn't have to go in routinely once a month, which is what a lot of people have to do. You would go in if your condition deteriorated and you needed to go in. So there is re-engineering of processes that way, which can improve efficiencies.
So here's a question which I think all of you actually have some expertise in answering. So what we've got, of course, is, I mean, every country's got its own healthcare system, but you've got in the UK, the NHS dominates everything, albeit with some private stuff on the side. We've got lots of startups. Several of you are investing in startups. You've got the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples, all of whom are sort of nibbling at the edges of this huge industry, this ecosystem of healthcare, and saying maybe there's something we can have here. Is it possible that this competition between all these different types of organizations is actually going to provide an impetus to create efficiency gains in some part of the system? I mean, that's perhaps a vain hope, but it's at least possible. Many of you are working in or with startups. Are these startups helping to?
Yeah, well, I would have thought so, but it's really important that they are able, these startups, to show effectiveness, good outcomes and effectiveness. So many of these apps and startups, their value is having numbers on the app, and they very rarely show an evidence-based or effectiveness. So that's crucial. And if you can show, I think there's huge opportunity for apps which can show that they are, easy to use, avatars or whatever it is, and effective for what they do in delivering sustainable better health or sustainable improvements in anxiety in the case of Serena. So I think that has to be the case. And I dread to use the word regulation, but nobody likes the word regulation, but somehow we have to try and ensure that the ones which are not really using AI or are not really showing any effectiveness somehow are dealt with, whether it's through regulation, I don't know, but that's a problem to me.
Yeah, Crystal?
We also talk about, so moving with the proliferation of these apps, You know, assuming that we can pull out, you know, sorting the wheat from the chaff in terms of effectiveness and really medically valuable things, let's also bring it back to, you know, I think I keep bringing it back, but it's really important, is diversity, equity, and inclusion in medicine. You know, Julian, you had your hip replacement, you had to go in every month to get treatment. What happens if you were living in rural Africa and it was a 10-mile walk every time you had to go in? You know, so by getting these apps, by getting, you know, I was recently reviewing someone that was looking at drones for delivering medicine in rural locations. You know, we can drop off medicine, we can pick up samples and go. All of a sudden, you have access to reasonably quality, good quality, let's say, healthcare for people who just never could have it before.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden with this technology, and I think sometimes we see this, you know, it can be adapted relatively quickly by a lot of people when there's no other option.
So can we run with that point? Because one of the questions we've got is, will the global differences in AI innovation significantly widen the inequality gap between the developed and developing world? Whereas the poll I showed at the beginning talked about, I mean, essentially the audience said they believe that it's actually going to help to address disparities. Chris, you've given us, I think, a nice example of how AI can potentially help to reduce that gap, or at least to help underserved areas. Other thoughts on the developed versus developing country divide? Obviously, Andrew, you're in India. Barbara, I think you've got some experience with this as well.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a little bit analogous to when the mobile phones came in and landlines, and basically then, you know, vast numbers of people in Africa and India have mobile phones now, whereas getting a landline was a huge issue. So they basically leapfrogged over that stage and went straight to the mobile phone. I think something similar can happen here, where instead of just going through trying to improve their basic healthcare systems, they may be able to leapfrog here. So I think there are opportunities. It's going to be patchy. I think a lot of the early stage companies that I talk to are actually doing trials in India, for instance. But I think, and they're also, the Middle East, there are countries are really investing in AI, although that's probably going to be mainly for the more wealthy members of the population rather than throughout the population. But I mean, Andrew's obviously in India, so I'm sure.
Andrew, your thoughts on that point?
No, I agree. I mean, having been into some really looking from the outside, quite old-fashioned buildings in small towns near Hyderabad, the equipment that they've got in them is absolutely top rate. They've clearly leapfrogged in many ways from what they would have had even 5 years ago, and really moved into the new gen. And so I think there is an opportunity for things like AI to leapfrog. I mean, it's partly perhaps because there's less regulation, that there's more freedom to sort of do these things without being held back. And I think that's the case in India, but there's certainly an appetite for innovation. And in fact, some of the most cost-effective surgery, cardiac surgery, is definitely done in India. You know, Devi Shetty and his team there, using, perhaps, I don't know about AI, but certainly using modern technology, they really have jumped. And there is a real opportunity, I think, to learn from some of that work.
Good. I want to move to a question about regulation. There's a couple of questions about regulation. I mean, obviously regulators have a job to do, which is to make this stuff safe. We touched on it already. What are your thoughts about, I mean, I guess the best way to ask it is, I'd like to be as optimistic as I possibly can here. I mean, do you think that regulators kind of get it in terms of the, you know, either fast tracking or opening up their minds as to using AI as an opportunity, or rather kind of as a risk? Who wants to have a go at the
Well, can I just start and say, I think at last, NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, for our overseas viewers, as it were, has actually started a formal program to look at health tech startups using AI. And you know, that's not a regulation, but it's checking that they are medical, that they are doing all the things you would expect, and that they are showing effectiveness. And I think that type of approach is important, but it doesn't mean to say that the others won't just carry on doing as they are, saying they're doing this, but they're not. But I think people should be looking for that sort of sign-off. And there's an organization called ORCA, which I forget what it stands for, but is trying to assess apps in the health tech field, and in terms of their utility and things like that. And I think that is one way to, people should be looking for those to see whether an app is one which they should be thinking about looking at.
So the analogy here for me is the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK for banking. I mean, you may or may not know much about banking, but you know, the UK has become this hub. London's become this hub for fintech, financial technology startups, because the FCA has created this regime whereby they allow people to try out their new stuff in a sort of a sandbox, which sandbox meaning, you know, a place where you can do it without risk of contamination of the rest of the system. Andrew, are you saying that NICE, or perhaps there's other regimes where they are trying to help startups try things out on an experimental basis?
They're doing exactly that. And Serena has, you know, this app, the mental health app I've talked about, has been given a sort of early approval for research purposes. And that's going to give us a great fillip, I think. And we're now doing a randomized controlled trial and so on. And but you see so many promises made by these things, and which just are not true. And how the question is, how do we manage that? How can we try and ensure that, you know, that, well, I don't want to be too rude about them, but really they are not delivering any sort of effectiveness, and yet people believe the marketing and go for it. And I suppose it's not sustainable. They realize after a while that they're not gaining anything from it and come off it. I suppose the market in a way may eventually you know, rule out, but it's not seeming to do that at the moment.
I mean, as you say, it's in any industry, you see this proliferation of companies emerging whenever any new technology comes along. Remember the dot-com boom, and you know, most of them will fail. Most of them should fail, and of course, the only difference here is it's potentially dangerous for users as well as for the investors in these companies. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump on this point about regulation, about how Nicos, do you have a thought on?
Just wanted to say that, you know, we focus a lot on regulation, and rightly so in this industry, you know, as well as any industry. I mean, we need to protect the end user. But you know, to my mind, the failures are not necessarily on the regulatory side, but on the fact that we often fail in healthcare to build a market after something has proven itself. So let's say, you know, the app that Andrew has mentioned, I mean, the Serena, which I know a little bit about. I mean, if it goes to prove itself, it's not clear who would buy it. I mean, the NHS doesn't have sort of one point of access that one can sort of, you know, sell a successful new application, even though it would save a lot of money. So I think we need to be thinking about sort of, yes, regulate to protect, but also at the same time, sort of put in the structures so that we create healthy markets for innovations that have proven themselves to proliferate.
I think especially,
sorry.
I would add one good thing about your app, Andrew, especially in the field of mental health. You know, this is life or death. You know, if you have a depressed person who's, you know, experienced a crisis or something like that, you know, apps like this can be life things. So it's so important to get them into the right hands, and the work Andrew's doing is fantastic.
So, but Marcus's point is true. I mean, the NHS has waiting times to see clinical psychologists of, you know, at least 6 months from the time of referral. Whereas an app, whatever the app, I mean, this is what we find, you know, you can, as soon as you can get onto it, you start straight away, and you're able to go through 6 sessions over a period of 6 weeks by yourself, self-managed. And at least clinical psychologists should be saying, in this case, well, why don't you try this while you're waiting? But it's absolutely impossible to get into the National Health Service. What they need, or a healthcare system needs, is somebody who is prepared to assess on behalf of the NHS these apps, and to say, it's a very disintegrated service, as we know, but to actually stand up and say this is a good one and this one is not, and so that the NHS has somewhere to go to, because otherwise you have to go through it everywhere you go, that you have to start again, and it makes life very difficult. So we are talking to universities and employers rather than the NHS, where the need is greatest.
Wow. Yeah, Barbara, you got a point on that, and I've got another
Yeah,
question.
absolutely. I mean, I think, yes, I mean, a lot of our early stage companies are really banging their head against a brick wall with the NHS. They can get feasibility, they can get pilots, feasibility studies, but actually getting adoption is a really difficult thing. But I completely agree with Nicos's point. I mean, I think regulators are incredibly important. They have to protect the public. That's really what they're there for. But that's only one step. And the next step is actually to get your product paid for. And you know, for instance, in the US, if you don't have a reimbursement code, you're not going to get your product used. So, and that's something that companies have to start thinking about very, very early on. It's not just getting over the regulatory hurdles, but you also have to think about how do you get your product commercially adopted, and what's the path to market from that point of view.
So I've got a lot of questions about aspects of user behavior, patient behavior. One specific one says, the panel seems to assume, I'm not sure you do, that because a patient can do something remotely, they will. In fact, those who need the care most don't. I mean, I think the broader point there is, you know, for these things to work, we've got to see a fundamental difference in the way that people behave. And I'd like your reflection on that. I mean, is it the case that certain segments of the population, ages or whatever, are showing themselves more willing to use these? How do you try to change?
Well, I don't want to come back too quickly, but I mean, I think we do find that younger people are more prepared to come onto an app where they don't have to see anybody. They don't have to download to a person. They're much happier coming onto a digital app where they can self-manage themselves. But older people don't like that, and they want to, they're not so keen at all on that sort of thing. As a very great generalization, and they prefer to have a face-to-face contact in some way. So we do see those sorts of difference, with younger people much more prepared to try some of these new technologies.
Yeah,
Other thoughts from the three of you on user behavior? Yeah, please, Barbara.
So I was just going to say, I agree with that. And we've got an aging population. And so we have to be very careful that the elderly don't become essentially disadvantaged because they're not digitally literate and at ease in the same way. And, and some areas of society as well. So we do have to be careful of this digital divide, that doesn't make things worse.
Yeah. Crystal?
And I would add to that as well, looking at volition. So one of the therapeutic areas that I'm responsible for at Takeda is depression. And, how are we dealing with folks with depression? And to get folks to engage is not trivial. If someone is in the middle of a low, brushing your hair can be insurmountable for the day. So I really do like this question, because the answer is it's very complicated, and speaking of the digital divide, and speaking of, when we talk about apps, we assume that everyone has a cell phone. But I think it's something like 20% of folks, and this is in America the last time I looked, but something like 20 to 25% of folks don't have access to a smartphone. Even in the US. And does that, and it usually has to do with socioeconomic status, it usually correlates with that. So does that even further disadvantage people who are poorer? How do we bring that back up? And that's a very good question.
Yep, thanks. I don't know if there's any more on that. I've got one final kind of big category of question. Let me just, a couple of people have asked about this, but it's this issue of what's going to happen to the jobs. That's always a question when AI comes along. And we all know that some jobs will over time disappear and other jobs will be created in that space. That's what history kind of tells us. Creative destruction, we call it in academia. So my question's got two parts, really. One is about, let's assume that most of our audience are interested in the world of healthcare for their careers. What sort of job areas are the big kind of growth areas within the healthcare profession? And then slightly related is, what are the sort of skills that people need to be kind of honing, if you like, for them to be successful in this artificial intelligence world? So, I mean, there's lots to that. I'm sure you've each got something to say on it. I'll go to Nicos first on this one.
Absolutely. I think anybody that can help healthcare actors, from hospitals to pharmaceutical firms to insurance companies, integrate AI, machine learning into their work processes will be extremely highly valued. And anybody that can act as the bridge between what AI can do and what the healthcare system can do, probably even more so. So, to anybody that's thinking about what to study, well, if you start from a clinical perspective, maybe invest a little bit of time understanding technical aspects of machine learning and data science, and helping people with a more technical background apply these skills to the needs of your sector, and vice versa.
Got it. And of course, London Business School has some great programs in analytics and management that people should be thinking about as they do that. Who else? Who's next? I don't know. Andrew, do you want to go next on this one?
What was the first question? Because
the first question was about what particular kind of jobs or professions within medical services, and then the second was more the specific skills that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've already heard that radiology and pathology and those sorts of things where there's sort of multiple routine things to have to go through are going to be very much sort of taken up more with AI, I think. If you want to have a job which is not under threat, although even being a surgeon is under threat these days because of robotics and things like that. But surgery, I suppose, is less likely to be using AI in terms of the actual practical process of the operation. But even with robots, someone has to operate the robot, and those sorts of things. So I think, those areas are pretty protected, as should be the individual, as I said before, the individual one-to-one patient-doctor interface, at least for the first meeting with a new condition. I think after that, other things can take over. Telemedicine takes over. You don't have to see the patient directly. And I would hope that people will come back to general practice once we get better AIs and systems in primary care, where there's a real problem of overload of paperwork and all the rest of it.
And it does seem that the human touch is something that we're never going to want to lose, right? And as you say, the human touch, Sally would say, over a screen is something we've kind of started to figure out, but we're a long way from those bots actually having a proper conversation with this person. Who wants to go next? We'll take both. Barbara, go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think historically people have been either from a biomedical background or from a tech background. The really successful people will be able to do both. They'll be literate in both genres. Yeah. And I think that's very important. And that will happen because basically all kids are going to learn to code. I think that's really important. You just grow up learning to code and it's just another thing you have. And then you add the biomedical expertise on top.
Yep. Crystal?
Point.
I was going to say, my innate answer to what do you need to learn programming. Learn computer science, boys and girls. Learn that, because that's the language of the future. And like I say, learn how to use technology. It's not AI that's going to take your job, but someone using AI will. So be that person using AI.
Exactly. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I mean, I'm just going to draw from the world of financial services. I saw an article in the Financial Times, and it said something along the lines of, when it comes to investing, human stupidity beats AI. And what they meant by that, of course, is that if you want to invest your pension in a tracker fund which follows the market, the AI can do that. It's very good at replicating, if you like, the FTSE index. But if you want to beat the market, or indeed run the risk of losing out, that's when the human interface comes in, because the human sometimes is taking on those slightly contrarian bets that help you to, as it were, beat the herd. Now, does that apply at all in the world of medical services or healthcare or pharmaceutical research? I mean, I want to bet that sometimes that kind of maverick sort of Elon Musk quality must sometimes pay dividends in your world. Any thoughts on that? It's a bit of a wild card question. I'm just wondering if anyone's got a thought on it.
I mean, to be very provocative, the maverick to me these days is the sort of doctor I was talking about, who has time to actually listen and use empathy and all that sort of thing, and really doesn't want to use the technology in that first interface. Right. And what is happening more and more is that the doctors aren't perhaps doing that as much as they used to, and they're doing a battery of tests to try and find out what it might be before they've really thought about, well, what is the diagnosis? And therefore we want to try and find, we've got 3 ideas, we want to now confirm which of those it is. So we're getting an awful lot of over intervention and over technology, you know, and I would hope that listening to the doctor and the doctor being at the center of things will remain.
It's a great,
some sort of control on that, but I'm not sure.
Great point. And you know, from Amazon drivers to call center workers to whatever, you know, technology can become this sort of big brother that absolutely, you know, drives our behavior to the point that we lose our human qualities altogether. So, you know, we mustn't let it do that. That is for sure. Any last thoughts on that slightly maverick question? I mean,
I think that, I mean, if you look at the investment into this area, investors tend to go according to fashions. So 1 or 2 will invest in an area, then a whole load of others will pile in and follow. And, you know, nobody gets fired for following the trend kind of thing. But the really successful ones tend to basically strike out and be the first to invest into a new area. So I completely agree. I think
it's a great point. I mean, all the money, the VC money, is piled into generative AI. You know, the earlier investors in that area probably will do well. The latter investors will not. You know, smart investors figure out what's next, rather than what's gone before. I think we're going to stop here, if that's okay. I mean, I'm not going to try to summarize our conversation. We've obviously covered a huge range of issues, and I really would like to thank our panelists enormously for their breadth of answers. I didn't get quite as much disagreement, I'm afraid, as perhaps I was looking for. You were all very nice to each other, but perhaps that means that the path forward is actually relatively clear in terms of where we want to go, even if not how we get there. Before we close, I would like to just tell everybody that there is a QR code which I should be flashed up on your screen about now, just to give you a link to information about our next event, which is coming up in November. It's on a different topic. It's called The Road to COP28, Aligning Expectations with Outcomes, which of course is all about the climate emergency. I believe I'm going to be one of the hosts of that as well. So please do come to that event. Obviously, there's going to be a whole series with our Think sort of moniker around it coming up this year and indeed next year. So with that, we are going to finish. Thanks once again to Crystal, to Barbara, to Andrew, and to Nicos. I really appreciate your very thoughtful insights into this topic. I will close. Thank you, audience. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of your questions, but we did get to quite a lot of them. Thank you for all your attention and all of your great questions. We will close there. Thank you from me and from London Business School, and good evening.